The restaurant's ambient lighting cast a warm glow over the holiday party. But Sarah Bennett felt anything but warm. Seated at a table near the back, she watched her co-workers laugh and mingle, their conversations flowing effortlessly in a world of sound she could only partially access through her hearing aids. At 34, she'd grown accustomed to being on the periphery, but tonight the loneliness felt especially acute. Sarah adjusted the deep red dress she'd chosen carefully for the evening, hoping it would give her confidence. As a graphic designer at Sterling Marketing Group, she was respected for her work, but socially she often felt invisible. Her colleagues were polite, certainly, but there was always that awkward pause when they realized they'd have to speak. More slowly, face her directly, make accommodations. Most didn't bother trying for long. Across the room, a group of her co-workers huddled together, glancing in her direction and laughing. Sarah's stomach tightened. She'd seen that look before, the mixture of pity and amusement that people wore when they talked about the deaf girl, like she was an object of curiosity rather than a person. What Sarah didn't know was that 3 of her colleagues, Brad, Jennifer, and Mike, had hatched what they considered a hilarious plan. They'd convinced Ethan Matthews, the new senior account executive who'd joined the company 2 months ago, to ask Sarah to dance as a joke. "Come on, it'll be funny," Brad had said earlier. His words slurred from too much wine. "She can't hear the music anyway. Watch her try to follow along." Ethan Matthews, at 38, had dark hair with distinguished touches of silver at the temples, and carried himself with quiet confidence. He was handsome in an understated way, with kind eyes that seemed to notice details others missed. He'd been listening to his co-worker's cruel scheme with growing disgust. "That's a terrible idea," Ethan had said firmly. "And if you think I'd participate in humiliating someone, you don't know me at all." But Brad and the others had been persistent, their judgment clouded by alcohol and a mean-spirited desire for entertainment. "She won't even know it's a joke," Jennifer had added. "Just ask her to dance, pretend you're interested, then we'll see what happens." Ethan had walked away from that conversation, but he couldn't stop thinking about Sarah. He'd noticed her from his first day at the company, not because of her hearing aids, but because of the way she listened when people spoke, the thoughtfulness in her responses, the quiet intelligence that radiated from her. He'd wanted to introduce himself properly for weeks, but had been overwhelmed with learning his new role. Now, watching her sit alone while her co-workers mocked her from afar, Ethan made a decision. He approached Sarah's table, his heart beating faster than he'd like to admit. Sarah looked up as a shadow fell across her table, surprised to see Ethan Matthews standing there. She'd noticed him around the office, hard not to notice. Someone who looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine, but they'd never spoken beyond brief pleasantries in the hallway. Ethan smiled and did something Sarah didn't expect. His hands began to move in fluid, practiced signs. "Hello, Sarah, my name is Ethan. Would you like to dance with me?" Sarah's eyes widened in shock. Perfect American Sign Language, executed with the confidence of someone who'd been signing for years. She blinked, certain she must have misunderstood. You know sign language?" She signed back, her hands trembling slightly. "I do," Ethan signed, his smile growing warmer. "My younger sister Emily is deaf. I've been signing since I was 6 years old. I'm sorry I haven't introduced myself properly before now. I've wanted to, but I wasn't sure if you preferred signing or speaking." "I can do both," Sarah signed, still processing this unexpected revelation. "I read lips fairly well, and I have hearing aids, but signing is easier, more comfortable." "Then let's sign," Ethan responded. "And please, would you dance with me?" "Not because anyone put me up to it, but because I'd genuinely like to spend time with you." Sarah glanced past him to where Brad, Jennifer, and Mike were watching, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion. "They told you to ask me as a joke, didn't they?" She signed, her hands sharp with hurt. Ethan's expression hardened. "They tried. I refused. What I'm doing now has nothing to do with them. I'm asking because I've wanted to talk to you since I started here, and I thought maybe tonight could be a good start." Sarah studied his face, looking for signs of deception, but found only sincerity. Slowly, she nodded and took his offered hand. As they moved to the dance floor, Sarah could feel eyes on them from all directions. The music was playing. She could feel its vibrations through the floor, but she couldn't hear the melody. It had always made dancing awkward, a reminder of everything she was missing, but Ethan didn't seem to notice or care. He positioned himself so she could see his hands, and as they began to move, he signed to her. The song is At Last by Etta James, slow tempo, romantic. Very classic. I'll help you feel the rhythm. He placed one hand at her waist, took her other hand in his, and began to move in slow, deliberate steps that matched the music's beat. Sarah followed his lead, and for the first time in her life, dancing didn't feel like a performance or a struggle. It felt natural. How did you learn to sign so well? Sarah asked, her free hand forming the signs even as they danced. Ethan smiled, understanding her perfectly. When they reached a slower part of the song, he signed back, "My sister Emily was born deaf. My parents immediately started learning ASL, and they made sure I learned too. Emily's not just my sister, she's one of my best friends. She taught me that deaf culture isn't about what's missing, but about a different way of experiencing the world." A beautiful way. Tears pricked Sarah's eyes. No one had ever spoken about her deafness like that before, as something beautiful rather than something broken. Around them, the restaurant had grown quieter. Other couples had stopped dancing to watch. Brad, Jennifer, and Mike stood frozen, their cruel joke backfiring spectacularly as they witnessed genuine connection. Instead of humiliation, why are people staring? Sarah signed, suddenly self-conscious. Ethan glanced around, then looked back at her with gentle understanding. Because we're beautiful together. Because watching two people communicate in sign language while dancing is something they've probably never seen before. And maybe because some of them are realizing they've underestimated you. As the song progressed, Ethan continued to sign to her, telling her about Emily, about growing up in a bilingual household where both English and ASL were spoken, about the deaf community events he still attended regularly. Sarah shared her own story, born with progressive hearing loss, mainstreamed in schools where she was often the only deaf student. The isolation she'd felt her entire life. It's exhausting, she signed, always being the one who has to accommodate everyone else. Always feeling like I'm asking for too much when I request. That people face me when they talk or repeat themselves. People think I'm rude when I don't respond to things I can't hear. You're not rude, Ethan signed emphatically. They're ignorant. There's a difference. When the song ended, neither of them moved immediately. They stood on the dance floor, still close, still communicating in silence, while the restaurant buzzed with conversation around them. Then Ethan did something unexpected. He turned to face their coworkers, particularly Brad, Jennifer, and Mike, and began to sign while speaking aloud simultaneously. "I want everyone here to understand something," he said, his voice carrying across the room while his hands moved with precision. "Sarah is one of the most talented designers in this company. She's professional, creative, and brilliant at her job. The fact that she's deaf doesn't diminish any of that. In fact, her perspective probably makes her better at visual communication than most of you." The room had gone completely silent now. Sarah's face flushed, torn between embarrassment and gratitude. Ethan continued, his signs and words equally passionate. "What I can't understand is why any of you would think it's funny to mock someone for being different. Why you'd see her deafness as entertainment rather than simply another way of being human. My sister Emily is deaf and she's one of the most accomplished people. I know, she's a professor of linguistics at Georgetown. Being deaf isn't a limitation. Your narrow-mindedness is." Brad had gone pale. Jennifer was staring at her shoes. Mike looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. "I'm sorry," Brad finally said, his voice small. "We were drunk and stupid and there's no excuse for it." Ethan's expression didn't soften. "You're right. There isn't, but the apology shouldn't go to me. It should go to Sarah in a way she can actually understand." Brad took a hesitant step forward, facing Sarah directly so she could read his lips. "I'm sorry," he said clearly. "What we planned was cruel and inexcusable." "You deserve better than that." Sarah nodded stiffly, accepting the apology but knowing it didn't erase the hurt. She'd heard similar apologies before, usually after someone realized they'd been caught being insensitive. As the party began to resume its normal rhythm, Ethan gently guided Sarah toward a quieter corner of the restaurant. They found a table away from the noise and crowd, where they could talk or rather sign more comfortably. I'm sorry you had to witness that, Sarah signed. And I'm sorry you felt like you had to defend me. I didn't have to, Ethan signed back. I wanted to. What they were planning was wrong, and silence would have made me complicit. They talked for 3 more hours that night, the conversation flowing easily between them. Ethan told her about his work in account management, his failed marriage 5 years ago to a woman who'd never bothered to learn to sign despite knowing Emily. Sarah shared her struggles in a hearing world, but also her pride in deaf culture, her involvement in the deaf community, her dreams of one day starting her own design firm that specifically hired deaf artists. Why haven't you? Ethan asked, genuinely curious. Sarah's hands moved slowly, thoughtfully. Fear, I suppose. Fear that clients won't want to work with a deaf-owned company. Fear that I'm not good enough. Fear of failing publicly. Emily felt that way too, Ethan signed, before she got her doctorate. She said the hardest part wasn't the academic work, it was believing she deserved to take up space in a hearing-dominated field. But she did it anyway. And you could too. As the party wound down, Ethan walked Sarah to her car. The December air was cold, their breath visible in small clouds. But neither seemed to notice. Can I see you again? Ethan signed. Not at a work event, but properly. Dinner, maybe? Or coffee? Sarah hesitated, old wounds making her cautious. Why? Because you feel sorry for me? No, Ethan signed firmly. Because you're fascinating. Because talking with you tonight has been the best conversation I've had in months. Because I find myself wanting to know everything about you. Your favorite books. What you do on weekends. Whether you prefer tea or coffee, what makes you laugh. Not despite your deafness and not because of it. Just because you're you. Sarah felt something crack open in her chest. A cautious hope she'd tried to protect for so long. Coffee, she signed. Saturday morning. I know a place run by a deaf couple. Best lattes in the city. And the entire staff signs. Perfect, Ethan signed, his smile radiant. Their first official date led to a second, then a third. Ethan introduced Sarah to his sister Emily via video chat, and the two women bonded, immediately over their shared experiences in the deaf community. Emily teased her brother mercilessly about finally finding someone worth learning to dance for. Sarah introduced Ethan to her parents, who were initially skeptical. They'd watched their daughters heartbreak too many times at the hands of hearing men who'd promised to learn sign language and never followed through. But Ethan's fluency and genuine respect for deaf culture won them over. 6 months into their relationship, Ethan surprised Sarah by taking her to a deaf theater production downtown. The entire performance was in ASL, with captions for hearing audience members rather than the reverse. Sarah had tears streaming down her face by the end, not from the play itself, but from the thoughtfulness of the gesture. In my entire life, she signed. Afterwards, no one outside my family has ever taken me to something designed for me, where I wasn't the one accommodating everyone else. Get used to it, Ethan signed back. This is just the beginning. He was true to his word. Their relationship was built on mutual respect and genuine effort. Ethan continued to improve his signing, learning new vocabulary and regional variations. Sarah taught him about deaf history, deaf art, deaf poetry. They found a rhythm that worked for both of them. Sometimes signing, sometimes speaking with Sarah reading lips, often doing both simultaneously. A year after that holiday party, Sarah finally took the leap and started her own design firm, Sterling and Associates, with Ethan's encouragement and business expertise. She hired 3 other deaf designers, creating a workspace where ASL was the primary language, and deaf culture was celebrated rather than accommodated. The business thrived. Clients discovered that Sarah's team brought a unique visual perspective to their work, that their designs had a clarity and boldness that came from communicating in a visual language every day. 2 years after their first dance, Ethan proposed to Sarah at a deaf community event, signing his proposal in front of 200 people who understood every word without hearing a sound. The community erupted in applause, hands waving in the air in the traditional deaf expression of celebration. Their wedding was a beautiful blend of both worlds, officiated in both ASL and spoken English, with interpreters for hearing guests and captions for key moments. Emily served as Sarah's maid of honor, signing a toast that left half the room in tears. "My brother learned to sign for me," Emily's hand said eloquently. "But he learned to love from Sarah. She taught him that vulnerability is strength, that differences make us richer, and that true communication comes from the heart, not the ears." At the reception, Ethan and Sarah shared their first dance as a married couple to "At Last," the same song from that night 2 years ago. But this time, Sarah wore a cochlear implant she'd recently decided to get, not because anyone pressured her, but because she wanted to hear her husband's voice on their wedding day. As the music played, Ethan signed to her even as he spoke aloud. "I love you. Not the idea of you, not the person I wish you were, but exactly who you are. Your deafness is part of you, and I love all of you." Sarah signed back through happy tears. "You saw me when I was invisible. You heard me when I was silent. You loved me when I felt unlovable. Thank you for being brave enough to ask me to dance." Years later, they would tell their children, one hearing, one deaf, about the night they met, about the cruel joke that became a beautiful beginning, about how Daddy's sign language fluency, learned out of love for his sister, created the foundation for their family. They taught both children to sign from birth, raising them bilingual, in English and ASL. They taught them that deaf culture was something to celebrate, that differences should be embraced, that love transcends the need for sound. And every year on their anniversary, Ethan and Sarah would return to that restaurant, request the same table where they'd first talked, and dance to "At Last" while signing to each other all the things words, spoken or signed, could barely contain. The co-workers who'd planned that cruel joke had long since moved on to other jobs, their names barely remembered. But the love that grew from their failed attempt at humiliation became something legendary in both the deaf and hearing communities, a reminder that sometimes the best love stories begin in the most unexpected ways, and that true communication happens when we're willing to learn someone else's language, literally and figuratively. Sarah's design firm eventually expanded to 3 offices across the state, providing employment and opportunity for dozens of deaf artists who'd previously been overlooked by hearing-owned companies. Ethan left his corporate job to become the firm's COO, using his business skills to amplify Sarah's vision. Together, they proved that love doesn't require sound. It requires presence, effort, respect, and the courage to see people as they truly are rather than as we expect them to be. It requires learning someone's language, understanding their culture, and celebrating their differences rather than trying to erase them. And it requires recognizing that sometimes the most profound conversations happen in silence, where hands speak what hearts feel, and where 2 people can find perfect understanding without uttering a single word aloud. And it requires recognizing that sometimes the most profound conversations happen in silence, where hands speak what hearts feel, and where 2 people can find perfect understanding without uttering a single word aloud. On quiet Sunday mornings, Ethan would watch Sarah work in her home studio, her hands moving between sketching and signing to herself as she thought through design problems. He'd learned that she narrated her creative process in ASL, her thoughts flowing through her fingers rather than her voice. It was beautiful, like watching someone compose poetry in 3 dimensions. Their children grew up understanding that communication came in many forms. Their son Marcus, who was hearing, became fluent in both languages by age 3, effortlessly switching between signing with his deaf sister, Nina, and speaking with hearing relatives. Nina, born profoundly deaf like her Aunt Emily, never saw her deafness as something wrong with her because her parents never treated it that way. "Mommy," Nina signed one evening when she was 7. "My friend at school asked why I can't hear. She said her mom said deaf people are broken." Sarah's hands moved gently, thoughtfully. "Did it make you feel broken?" Nina shook her head emphatically. "No! I told her deaf people aren't broken. We just experience the world differently, like how some people see in color and some people are colorblind. Different isn't broken." Sarah pulled her daughter close, grateful that Nina would grow up with a confidence she herself had taken decades to develop.